Our last two speakers will be Matthew Laza, who is director in the Policy Network, which is a leading international think tank, and he's an experienced broadcast journalist prior to that, and was a senior BBC Current Affairs programme maker, and formerly also senior advisor to the UK Leader of the Opposition in the run-up to the 2015 election.
I'm really pleased to be here, not least because it gives me another city to put on my T-shirt I'm having produced for Christmas, which is my Brexit World Tour T-shirt. I think it's the only one it's like I'm ever going to get, because I don't think that British think tank people are going to be too popular across Europe. But I've got Oslo, I've got Stockholm, Vienna, and of course Dublin, which must go at the top because I'm in Dublin, and you have to say that when you're here. But in all seriousness, it has, as Hilary said so eloquently, been a pretty grim year for us as progressives. When I go around on this Brexit World Tour, the first question that I get asked after I've done my spiel is, what about Ireland? And the second question I get asked is, what about Scotland? And they're not entirely unrelated, and we might explore those in questions later. I actually just looked at my notes when I was here that I did for one that I did in Vienna a few weeks ago, and it was about what the British government's plan is. And I'd written, have your cake and eat it. This was exactly 5 days before the Tory staffer was seen in Downing Street having that as written as the strategy. So I'm hoping that I'll get the call from number 10 and be invited soon to join the government. The truth of the matter is, I'm the think tank guy, so I can be a little bit more candid than the politicians. Is the British government doesn't have a clue about what it's doing. Thank goodness we've got Hilary and the committee, which is not, and to be unpartisan about it. There were good people on the Conservative benches, on the Scottish Nationalist benches, and clearly SDLP colleagues as well, who are pressing questions home, and those questions really do need pressing, because reverse Greenland I'm loving. When I was in Oslo, I was saying you'd never realise that there's never been so much talk of the Norwegian model. Until this year, the Norwegian model meant something completely different in the British discourse. What's literally the sort of searching around for an off-the-shelf model has been rather desperate and isn't going to work. I mean, I never thought I'd spend my morning looking at what the Swiss lower house was saying about employment preferences for EU nationals versus Swiss nationals in employment. I mean, there is a desperate search for answers out there. And as Hilary said, I was in Austria. It's quite nice to go to an election-winning party, and so I went to Vienna just for, it was slightly more than just for that, but it was nice to be with a bunch. Nice to be on the winning side. But as Hilary says, when 53% of people, or 54% of people, 46% of people are voting for what is effectively a Nazi, it's pretty grim. Here is my shock statistic. I won't do it as a question answer, but the percentage of industrial workers in Austria who voted for the far right, let's be polite and call them the far right candidate, 85%. So 85% of industrial workers who, between 1945 and 1989, Austria had the record for the highest average, not Sweden, the Swedes love to claim it was them, but not Sweden. Austria had the highest average vote for the main party of the centre-left. And that vote clearly involved a lot of industrial workers for decades. 2 weeks ago, 85% of those industrial workers voted for the candidate who couldn't be more opposed to our values. So I'm just going to say a few things about what I think the lessons are for progressive parties across Europe, not least the British Labour Party. Hilary and his colleagues did a fantastic job. I'm allowed to say it, Hilary isn't. I was not happy, to put mildly, and I've written about how I was ashamed of what our current party leader did in the campaign, because I think if we'd shown leadership as a party and as a movement, we would still be in the European Union and we would be discussing something else tonight. It is, and therefore it is particularly pleasing that Hilary's got the new job that he has and is going to be holding the government to account, which is fantastic. What happened in Austria a few weeks ago, and I know we'll talk about this more in a moment, but what happened in America what's likely to happen next year in France, even if, as we hope, Le Pen is ultimately thwarted, but will clearly have a good thing. What's going to happen in the Netherlands? I won't steal your thunder if you're going to talk about the Netherlands, but clearly this is a pattern all across the industrial world, and it's a pattern, just as those 85% of industrial workers, it's a pattern of the traditional vote that our parties have relied on across the world, turning its back on us. And it's a vote that sometimes we felt a bit uncomfortable with. I had a moment during the referendum campaign I totally agree about if every one of those people who signed the petition or bought the New European or, clicked like on Facebook had gone and knocked on a door. But to be fair, some of Jeremy Corbyn's most ardent young supporters in the part, I'm from Manchester, South Manchester, which did vote to stay in, and one of the young guys went their first time handing out leaflets, and they went up to, and remember this is in an area which voted 65% to stay in the EU. They went up to an older lady, and he handed a very enthusiastically his leaflet. She then ripped it like that in front of his thing and said Enoch was right, and threw it at him. That was the first time he'd ever done any political activity. And that gives you, I tell that story because just to give a sense of the gulf that we have between some of the people involved in our politics, and in Britain particularly the 300,000-400,000 people who've got themselves a vote one way or another in the Labour leadership contest, and our traditional vote. It really is not so much a gap, more a gulf. What I want to do is really just make 4 or 5 very quick points about how, as progressive parties, we need to get back in touch with that vote and listen to that vote, however difficult that might be, because I don't think Enoch was right, that woman was wrong, and how do you have that conversation is a hugely important thing. I think you begin, number one, by having that conversation. I know Hillary and other MPs in Leeds have done that. A very good friend of mine has the distinction of being the Labour MP, my best friend has the distinction of being the Labour MP with the highest outvote in the UK, even though she campaigned to stay in. And she is going round starting in January, and she's literally just going to go and have conversations with, she's identified a dozen groups of people in her constituency, from first-time voters to the golf club to the jazzercise classes and the local sports centre, and just have a conversation. She comes from quite a traditional white working-class community. So I think the first lesson we should learn, which is the Hillary lesson, is that rainbow coalitions aren't enough. I don't mean in terms of forming governments, but I mean in terms of expecting that centre-left parties can rely on minority votes and basically, trendy middle-class metropolitan votes, the sort of people that Theresa May has identified in her sights. And, the truth of the matter is that are represented here tonight and are represented in all progressive parties across the world, but we need to realise that we're not enough, as it were, that we have to remember that our traditional support matters. Second point I'd made is that we need to have the conversation. I think sometimes, in some parts, we have lost the art of talking to people who don't agree with us. And I think that's an art that we need to learn rapidly. There's a big question about where our politicians come from. I made, as I said, I worked for the BBC for a long time, and one of the last documentaries I made was called Posh and Posher, Why Public School Boys Run Britain. It's available on YouTube if you're particularly glutton for punishment. In that documentary, we charted, quite how posh Nick Clegg was, quite how posh David Cameron was, and who was the posher. But we also looked at the background of Labour MPs and found that this is the 2010 intake of Labour MPs, only a handful had come from what you might call traditional working class jobs. And you know what? They're some of the most sensible people in the House of Commons. There's a guy called Graham Jones, who was a former printer, who is an absolutely fantastic MP, who when I went to work for Ed Miliband, was the first person to come up to me and tell me what Ed was doing wrong. A, had the balls to do it, and B, his analysis was absolutely clear and was absolutely reflected in what happened in the 2015 UK general election. So let's have those conversations. 3, we can't ignore immigration. We can't tell people that they are wrong on immigration and their worries about immigration, even if we think that the world is more complex, and it generally is, than the idea that a lot of our voters have in their heads. But we have to confront the issue head on. endless polling. We on the Policy Network website, there's an interesting article for a pollster called James Morris about Just, who's polled both in Europe and in the US, about how if we ignore immigration and pretend that we don't want to talk about it, we literally aren't going to be listened to on 90% of other issues. It is now such a big issue, it can't be ignored, and not talking about it is blocking our message on other issues being heard. Fourth, and this is a particular danger in the UK, is that we don't have, we come up with concrete answers for the what Hillary and I, we called the squeeze middle during the 2015 UK general election campaign, but Mrs May is calling the jams, the just about managings. But the sort of, just about managing, what you might even call, oddly, people, sociologists probably wouldn't call them working class anymore, but the sort of, the vote, the sort of people, second generation people going to university, first generation people going to university, but where, of the couple, one might be on a minimum wage job, their child might be, one of their kids might be on a 0 hours contract. We need really serious answers for their problems, and I'm not sure that every progressive party in Europe quite has those answers at the moment. And finally, on social media, loathe it though, and love it or loathe it though we do, it isn't going to go away. The most depressing experience I just realised actually that I'm meant to be at my local Labour Party tonight, and I better send them a text saying I'm not there, but a recent local Labour Party meeting, a person who I was cheering because she was backing the right candidate for the leadership suggested that we should all go around and hide copies of the Daily Mail in every supermarket in the city. It's not really going to work. We're not going to get the sidebar of shame out of people's radar by going to hide the paper. So we have to engage with social media. We have to find more effective ways of doing that. And what we mustn't do, to conclude, which I think is the big danger for Progressive Party, which I'm very pleased to see Irish Labour with hashtag Labour Rebuild is looking outwards, is turning in on ourselves and just talking to our friends. The lesson from Brexit, the lesson from Austria, the lesson from the elections next year is that we have to talk to those who we don't always feel naturally comfortable with. Otherwise, we don't have a future as a movement. Thank you.